The neighborhood had always appeared pristine on the surface, well-trimmed lawns, perfectly painted fences, and uniform mailboxes standing in straight, measured lines. From the outside, it looked like a picture of suburban peace. But beneath the tidy facade, there simmered a constant tension between individuality and control. A battle waged quietly in HOA meetings, and petty violation notices slipped into mailboxes. For years, the homeowner had abided by the rules. The lawn was maintained, the trash bins rolled out at the proper hour, the hedges trimmed to regulation height. It wasn't that they agreed with the endless list of guidelines. It was simply easier to comply than to fight. But everything changed the day they decided to put up a flag. It wasn't just any flag, it was the American flag, proudly mounted on a pole at the edge of the driveway. For the homeowner, it was a symbol of family history, sacrifice, and freedom. Their father had served in the military, and the flag was more than cloth. It was memory, pride, and heritage. When it went up, neighbors waved and smiled. Children riding their bikes stopped to admire how it rippled in the wind. It seemed harmless, even inspiring. But the HOA saw it differently. The first letter came a week later, neatly folded and stamped with the board's insignia. The message was clear. The flag violated aesthetic standards of the community. They demanded it be removed within 10 days, or fines would begin accumulating. At first, the homeowner thought it must be a mistake. How could the HOA, in a country built on freedom, demand the removal of the national flag? But then the second notice arrived, harsher in tone, warning of escalating penalties and potential legal action. The board's language was deliberate. Designed to intimidate? They cited obscure clauses in the bylaws, vague references to uniformity, and implied that the flag was somehow disruptive to the community's image. The homeowner felt the first embers of anger spark within. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control. The HOA had long thrived on petty rules and intimidation, but this time they had chosen the wrong battle. The flag was not coming down. Each day that passed, the homeowner noticed subtle shifts in the neighborhood. Karen, the loudest voice on the HOA board, began patrolling more frequently, her gaze fixed on the pole, as if it were a personal insult. Other board members muttered about setting an example. Neighbors, however, quietly offered encouragement, stopping on walks to say they admired the stand being taken. The divide was growing sharper. The fines began to arrive in the mail. $50 the first week, $100 the next, and escalating from there. Each notice felt heavier than the last, carrying not just the weight of money but the arrogance of power. Still, the flag flew every morning, bright against the sky, a silent act of defiance that grew louder with every attempt to silence it. As the pressure mounted, the homeowner realized that fighting this battle in silence was exactly what the HOA wanted. They thrived in the shadows, using quiet intimidation to bend individuals into compliance. To win, this had to be brought into the light. Late one evening, the homeowner sat at their desk, surrounded by stacks of violation letters and bylaws. A plan began to form. It wasn't enough to resist privately. This story needed to be told loudly, publicly, and in a way that the HOA could never control. If the board wanted to play hardball, then it was time to bring the entire community, and beyond, into the fight. The decision was clear. The HOA had chosen the wrong opponent. Te flag wasinti justangit was about to go viral. The stage was set, and the homeowner knew the next step would not only expose the board's pettiness, but challenge their very foundation. The battle had begun, and it was only going to get bigger. The next morning began like every other, coffee in hand, the sound of sprinklers ticking in the distance, and the flag swaying proudly in the breeze. But this morning carried a different energy. The homeowner wasn't just defying the HOA anymore, they were preparing to expose them. The plan was simple but powerful. Document everything. Every letter, every fine, every ounce of intimidation the board had tried to enforce would now serve as evidence. The homeowner gathered the stack of violation notices and spread them across the table. Each paper was carefully photographed, their bold red warnings highlighted under the morning light. Then came the video. The camera panned from the flag waving high in the yard to the pile of notices stacked like a monument to bureaucracy and control. The homeowner narrated the situation calmly, explaining how the HOA was demanding the removal of a national symbol under the guise of aesthetic uniformity. The tone wasn't angry, it was steady, rational, and deeply personal. This wasn't about breaking rules. It was about standing up for principle. Once the video was posted online, it spread faster than expected. Within hours, comments began to pour in. Some were shocked that an HOA would dare to fine someone for flying the flag. Others shared their own horror stories of power-hungry boards and petty neighborhood drama. The story tapped into something bigger than a single dispute. It resonated with a national frustration over control, freedom, and the fight to keep individuality alive in rigid communities. By the end of the first day, the video had thousands of views. By the end of the week, it had hundreds of thousands. Local news outlets reached out for interviews. Reporters knocked on the door, cameras eager to capture the flag that had sparked a movement. What had begun as a quiet conflict in one neighborhood was now a public spectacle. The HOA, however, didn't retreat. Instead, they doubled down. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of the board, sent another letter dripping with indignation, accusing the homeowner of inciting hostility against the community. They threatened legal escalation, mentioning possible liens on the property if fines went unpaid. But the tide was shifting. Neighbors who once kept silent now stepped into the open. Some put up their own flags in solidarity. Others attended the next HOA meeting, demanding answers and transparency. The board, used to unchallenged control, suddenly found itself on the defensive. The homeowner watched it all unfold with a mix of determination and disbelief. The fight had grown larger than they could have imagined, and every new headline, every viral comment, only strengthened their resolve. What the HOA had hoped to suppress had become a rallying cry. Still, the battle wasn't won. The fines continued to accumulate, and the board showed no signs of backing down. The homeowner knew the next step had to be decisive, something that would not only protect their right to fly the flag, but also hold the HOA accountable for their abuse of power. As the second month of the conflict began, the homeowner prepared for the next phase. They had public support, media attention, and a community slowly rallying to their side. The HOA wanted this to be a private struggle, but now it had become a public reckoning. The question was no longer whether the flag would come down. The question was how far the board was willing to go and how much further the homeowner was prepared to take this fight. The answer, as they would soon learn, would shake the HOA to its very core. The letter arrived in a thick envelope, heavier than the previous notices. Unlike the earlier warnings and fines, this one carried the weight of intimidation. It was stamped with the HOA's attorney's letterhead, filled with legal jargon that was designed to scare, not inform. The message was clear: comply, or prepare for war. The HOA accused the homeowner of violating community bylaws, disrupting the visual integrity of the neighborhood, and creating hostility by dragging their private dispute into the public eye. Buried within the threats was the most dangerous line of all: the possibility of placing a lien on the property. That meant the home itself, the sanctuary and pride of the family, was suddenly at risk. For many, that kind of pressure would have been enough to break their spirit. But the homeowner had something the HOA did not. The viral video had sparked not only outrage but also support from lawyers, veterans, and free speech advocates, who saw this case as a symbol of something larger. Emails poured in daily offering pro bono representation. One particular attorney, with a reputation for dismantling overreaching HOAs, agreed to take on the case. The legal strategy was straightforward. First, establish that the HOA's rules directly contradicted federal protections for displaying the national flag. Next, expose their abuse of power by documenting every fine, every harassing letter, and every threat they had made. Finally, use the public spotlight to ensure the HOA couldn't quietly retreat without consequences. As the homeowner and lawyer prepared their case, the HOA scrambled to maintain control. Meetings grew tense. Karen, the most vocal board member, ranted about protecting the community's image. Other board members, once united, began to fracture under pressure. Some whispered that the legal fight wasn't worth the risk. Others feared the financial ruin that could come from losing a lawsuit, since HOA funds came from homeowner dues. Meanwhile, the homeowner doubled down on public exposure. A second video was posted, this time revealing the HOA's threats of a lien. The video exploded even more than the first, climbing into the millions of views. News anchors debated it on morning shows. radio hosts discussed it with passion, and strangers across the country flooded the HOA's public website with criticism. Neighbors grew braver. Flags multiplied on lawns throughout the community, a silent but powerful rebellion against the board's demands. Where once there was only one flag, now there were dozens. Karen seethed at the sight, each fluttering fabric a reminder that her control was slipping. The attorney filed the first set of legal responses, citing federal law and demanding the HOA immediately cease their harassment. They also hinted at the possibility of countersuing for damages, claiming emotional distress and abuse of authority. The mere mention of countersuits sent ripples of fear through the board. If they lost, it wouldn't just be a matter of removing fines, they could face financial devastation. Despite the mounting resistance, the HOA refused to back down completely. They scheduled a special meeting, promising to address the disruption caused by one homeowner's disregard for community standards. Flyers went out across the neighborhood, urging residents to attend. What the board envisioned as a show of authority would soon turn into something entirely different. The homeowner prepared carefully for that night. They gathered their evidence, their lawyer's advice, and the support of neighbors who had pledged to stand beside them. But more importantly, they knew that the entire country was now watching. When the meeting began, the room was packed. Neighbors filled the seats, reporters stood in the back, and cameras rolled. For the first time, the HOA could not hide behind closed doors or whispered threats. The homeowner walked in with their head high, knowing this wasn't just a fight about a flag anymore. It was about exposing an abuse of power that had gone unchecked for too long. The board members sat stiffly at the front, Karen's glare sharp enough to cut glass. Papers shuffled, microphones buzzed, and tension crackled in the air. This meeting would decide much more than the fate of one homeowner's flag. It would decide whether the HOA still held power or if that power had already slipped through their fingers. The night of the HOA meeting carried a charged atmosphere that could be felt even before entering the community hall. Cars lined the streets, far more than usual, for a board gathering. Neighbors who had never attended a single meeting arrived in groups, many carrying small American flags tucked under their arms or clipped to their jackets. The HOA had wanted a show of authority, but what they had summoned instead was a gathering of resistance. Inside, the tension was suffocating. The board members sat rigid at their long table, their faces stern, trying desperately to project control. Karen, seated in the center like a self-appointed queen, looked as though she had prepared for battle. Her stack of papers was thick with complaints, violations, and scripted talking points. She believed she would cow the homeowner into silence and reassert the board's dominance. But what she had not counted on was the sheer number of residents now standing against her. The seats filled quickly, the aisles crammed with people leaning against walls, and still more spilled outside the doors. Reporters hovered at the back, cameras ready. The flashing of bulbs from smartphones lit up the room as neighbors recorded everything, ensuring no manipulation of facts could occur. The meeting began with the usual procedural motions, read aloud in an effort to project normalcy. But the air was restless. The moment the floor opened for discussion, voices surged like a wave. The homeowner.com, but resolute, stepped forward. Every movement was watched, every word recorded. In their hands, they carried a binder thick with evidence. The HOAS, fines, letters, and threats of liens. They began recounting the timeline of harassment, methodically laying out how the board had crossed the line from enforcing community standards to abusing their power. When the flag itself became the centerpiece of the narrative, the room erupted in murmurs of support. Neighbors nodded. Some even clapped quietly, despite Karen's attempts to shush them. Then came the moment that truly shifted the room. The homeowner's attorney, who had been quietly observing from the crowd, stepped forward with legal documents in hand. He outlined the federal law that protected the right to fly the flag, citing chapter and verse. He explained in clear terms that the HOA had not only overstepped their authority, but had violated federal protections, exposing themselves to potential lawsuits. The camera zoomed in on Karen's face as the words hit like a hammer. Her jaw clenched, her grip on the papers tightened, but her eyes betrayed the first flickers of doubt. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The united front they once presented was fracturing under the weight of undeniable truth. Neighbors began to speak next. One by one, they shared their frustrations about arbitrary fines, about selective enforcement, about the intimidation they had endured for years. The flag dispute had lit a spark, but now it was a fire consuming every corner of the board's authority. The residents who had once been silent now spoke with anger and passion. Emboldened by the knowledge that the world was watching, Karen attempted to regain control, slamming her papers down and demanding order. She tried to redirect blame, painting the homeowner as disruptive, reckless, and selfish, but her words were drowned out by the voices of the community. The more she ranted, the more isolated she became, until she was shouting into a void of disapproval. The breaking point came when a reporter raised a hand and asked Karen a simple, direct question. Why was the board willing to risk lawsuits, community division, and public humiliation over a homeowner's right to fly the flag? Cameras flashed, pens scribbled, and every person in the room leaned forward for her response. But no matter how she answered, the truth was already plain. There was no justification that would stand. By the time the meeting adjourned, the balance of power had shifted entirely. The HOA no longer looked like an authority, they looked like a crumbling regime, desperately clinging to relevance. The homeowner walked out, not as a victim, but as the face of a movement. Neighbors shook their hand, reporters pressed for interviews, and social media lit up with clips from the meeting that spread faster than wildfire. For Karen, it was the beginning of the end. For the homeowner, it was proof that standing up had been worth the fight. But for the HOA as a whole, it was a reckoning they could no longer avoid. And yet, the fight wasn't finished. The HOA still had legal threats in motion, and Karen, humiliated but unyielding, was already plotting her next move. The real battle, it seemed, was only just beginning. The days following the HOA meeting were unlike anything the neighborhood had ever experienced. What was supposed to have been a show of force by the board turned into a public relations disaster. Clips of Karen shouting at residents, the attorney citing federal law, and neighbors defiantly waving flags outside their homes were shared across news networks, talk shows, and social media feeds. The story had grown too large for the HOA to contain, but instead of retreating, the board doubled down. Their attorney filed a formal notice of intent to pursue legal action, claiming the homeowner had defamed the HOA and violated the Peace and Harmony Clause in the community bylaw. It was a desperate attempt to claw back control, but it carried with it a dangerous gamble. If the HOA pushed too far and lost, the financial fallout would be catastrophic. For the homeowner, however, this was not a moment of fear, it was an opportunity. Their lawyer immediately drafted a countersuit, not only citing the federal protections for displaying the flag, but also alleging harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. The countersuit sought damages, attorney fees, and a full audit of the HOA's finances. Suddenly, it wasn't just about the flag anymore, it was about exposing years of mismanagement that had gone unchecked. As the legal paperwork flew back and forth, the cracks within the HOA deepened. Some board members quietly reached out to neighbors, apologizing for the chaos. Others resigned altogether, unwilling to be associated with Karen's crusade. But Karen herself refused to back down. Her stubbornness was legendary, and she clung to the belief that she could still bend the community to her will if she fought hard enough. The homeowners' viral videos continued to fuel the fire. Each update they posted, whether it was reading the HOA's new threats or showing support from veterans groups, garnered millions of views. The public had chosen sides, and the HOA was painted as the villain in every narrative. Donations poured in to support the homeowners' legal fight, ensuring that no matter how long it dragged on, they would not be out. Behind closed doors, the HOA's financial situation grew dire. Their legal bills skyrocketed, funded by the very dues homeowners paid. Residents who once tolerated the board's heavy hand now seethed with anger, knowing their money was being wasted on a hopeless battle. Some withheld payments, others organized petitions, and whispers of dissolving the HOA altogether grew louder. The climax came when the case finally landed in court for an emergency hearing. The homeowner's attorney presented a meticulous case, laying bare not just the violations of federal law, but also the reckless behavior of the board. Emails were entered into evidence, messages from Karen mocking the homeowner, boasting about making an example out of them, and dismissing any concerns about legality. Those emails destroyed what little credibility the board had left. The judge, stern and unmoved by theatrics, reminded the HOA's attorney of the federal protections they had ignored. He expressed concern over the board's misuse of authority and allowed the countersuit to proceed. It was not a final ruling, but it was a devastating blow. The HOA had not only failed to silence the homeowner, but it opened themselves to far greater consequences. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as the homeowner addressed reporters. Their calm presence, paired with the sight of their attorney standing beside them, painted a picture of resilience and justice. Across the street, Karen stormed out of the courthouse, avoiding reporters' questions, her fury etched on her face for all to see. That day marked the true breaking point. The HOA was no longer feared. They were ridiculed, despised, and crumbling under the weight of their own arrogance. The community, once silent, now rallied openly against them. Flags waved proudly in driveways and yards, each one a symbol of defiance and unity. And yet, one final confrontation still loomed. The lawsuit was moving forward, and the financial collapse of the HOA was only a matter of time. Karen would not surrender easily, but her reign was nearly at its end. The stage was set for the final chapter where the fight for one flag would bring an entire HOA to its knees. The final months of the battle unfolded like a slow-motion collapse, with each decision AHA outline and each legal setback pulling the HOA closer to ruin. What had started as a single complaint about a flag had spiraled into a national story, a courtroom drama, and a neighborhood uprising that could no longer be contained. The homeowner's countersuit gained traction quickly. Discovery revealed years of questionable financial practices, money spent without proper documentation, fines levied inconsistently, and evidence that certain board members had exempted themselves from rules they strictly enforced on others. Every document painted a clearer picture of corruption and arrogance, and each leak to the press stoked the fire. Neighbors who once avoided HOA politics now became deeply involved. Meetings were flooded with residents demanding transparency, shouting for resignations, and openly defying rules they once quietly obeyed. The board could no longer control the narrative. Each attempt at spin was met with laughter, boos, or viral clips that painted them as even more out of touch. Karen, once the loudest voice of authority, was now a pariah. Her face, once commanding, now appeared in memes across social media. Every time she tried to assert control, her words were twisted into ridicule by an audience hungry for her downfall. The very power she had wielded so mercilessly had become her undoing. The court case eventually reached its climax in a settlement conference. Facing mounting legal bills, a fractured board, and the looming threat of losing completely in trial, the HOA conceded. They agreed to not only drop all fines and threats against the homeowner, but also to pay damages, attorney fees, and issue a public statement acknowledging their mistake. The flag could stay. The lien was void. The harassment would end. But the victory extended far beyond one homeowner. In the wake of the lawsuit, the community voted to dissolve the HOA altogether. Years of frustration had boiled over into decisive action, and the residents reclaimed control of their neighborhood. What was once ruled by intimidation and arbitrary enforcement was now free from the grip of those who had abused their power. The day the settlement was finalized, the homeowners stood in their driveway as neighbors gathered. Flags rippled across the street, each one a quiet but powerful declaration of victory. There was no need for grand speeches. The sight alone was enough. A neighborhood united, no longer silenced. For Karen, the end was bitter. She resigned in disgrace, her reputation destroyed beyond repair. For the HOA, the collapse was total, leaving behind a cautionary tale of power abused and justice denied, until one person stood firm. And for the homeowner, the lesson was clear. A battle that began over a single flag had become something much larger. A